Chapter 10, Part 2 of The Legends of the Jews, Volume 4. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Chapter 10, Part 2, The Exile, The Great Lament. On his return from Anathoth, Jeremiah saw at a distance smoke curling upward from the Temple Mount, and his spirit was joyful. He thought the Jews had repented of their sins and were bringing incense offerings. Once within the city walls, he knew the truth, that the temple had fallen a prey to the incendiary. Overwhelmed by grief, he cried out, "O Lord, thou didst entice me, and I permitted myself to be enticed. Thou didst send me forth out of thy house, that thou mightest destroy it." God himself was deeply moved by the destruction of the temple, which he had abandoned that the enemy might enter and destroy it. Accompanied by the angels, he visited the ruins and gave vent to his sorrow. "Woe is me on account of my house! Where are my children? Where my priests? Where my beloved? But what could I do for you? Did I not warn you? Yet you would not mend your ways." "Today," God said to Jeremiah, "I am like a man who has an only son. He prepares the marriage canopy for him, and his only beloved dies under it. Thou doest seem to feel but little sympathy with me and with my children. Go, summon Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Moses from their graves. They know how to mourn." "Lord of the world," replied Jeremiah, "I know not where Moses is buried." "Stand on the banks of the Jordan," said God, "and cry, 'Thou son of Amram, arise, see how wolves have devoured thy sheep.'" Jeremiah repaired to the double cave and spake to the patriarchs, "Arise, ye are summoned to appear before God." When they asked him the reason of the summons, he feigned ignorance, for he feared to tell them the true reason. They might have cast reproaches upon him that so great a disaster had overtaken Israel in his time. Then Jeremiah journeyed on to the banks of the Jordan, and there he called as he had been bidden, "Thou son of Amram, arise, thou art cited to appear before God." "What has happened this day, that God calls me unto him?" asked Moses. "I know not," replied Jeremiah again. Moses thereupon went to the angels, and from them he learned that the temple had been destroyed, and Israel banished from his land. Weeping and mourning, Moses joined the patriarchs, and together, rending their garments and wringing their hands, they betook themselves to the ruins of the temple. Here their wailing was augmented by the loud lamentations of the angels. "How desolate are the highways to Jerusalem, the highways destined for travel without end! How deserted are the streets that once were thronged at the seasons of the pilgrimages! O Lord of the world, with Abraham, the father of thy people, who taught the world to know thee as the ruler of the universe, thou didst make a covenant that through him and his descendants the earth should be filled with people, and now thou hast dissolved thy covenant with him. O Lord of the world, thou hast scorned Zion and Jerusalem, once thy chosen habitation. Thou hast dealt more harshly with Israel than with the generation of Enosh, the first idolaters." God thereupon said to the angels, "Why do ye array yourselves against me with your complaints, Lord of the world?" They replied, "On account of Abraham, thy beloved, who has come into thy house wailing and weeping, yet thou payest no heed unto him." Thereupon God, "Since my beloved ended his earthly career, he has not been in my house. What hath my beloved to do in my house?" Now Abraham entered into the conversation. "Why, O Lord of the world, hast thou exiled my children, delivered them into the hands of the nations, who torture them with all tortures, and who have rendered desolate the sanctuary, where I was ready to bring thee my son Isaac as a sacrifice?" "Thy children have sinned," said God. "They have transgressed the whole Torah. They have offended against every letter of it." Abraham: "Who is there that will testify against Israel that he has transgressed the Torah?" God: "Let the Torah herself appear and testify." The Torah came, and Abraham addressed her. O my daughter, dost thou indeed come to testify against Israel, to say that he violated thy commandments? Dost thou feel no shame? Remember the day on which God offered thee to all the peoples, all the nations of the earth, and they all rejected thee with disdain. Then my children came to Sinai, they accepted thee, and they honored thee, and now on the day of their distress thou standest up against them. Hearing this, the Torah stepped aside and did not testify. Let the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet in which Torah is written come and testify against Israel, said God. They appeared without delay, and Aleph, the first letter, was about to testify against Israel, when Abraham interrupted it with the words, Thou, chief of all letters, thou comest to testify against Israel in the time of his distress. Be mindful of the day on which God revealed himself on Mount Sinai, beginning his words with thee, Anoki, the Lord thy God. No people, no nation accepted thee, only my children, and now thou comest to testify against them. Aleph stepped aside and was silent. The same happened with the second letter, Bet, and with the third, Gimel, and with all the rest. All of them retired abashed, and opened not their mouth. Now Abraham turned to God and said, O Lord of the world, when I was 100 years old, thou didst give me a son, and when he was in the flower of his age, 37 years old, thou didst command me to sacrifice him to thee, and I, like a monster without compassion, I bound him upon the altar with mine own hands. Let that plead with thee, and have thou pity on my children. Then Isaac raised his voice and spake, O Lord of the world, when my father told me, God will provide himself the lamb for a burnt offering, my son, I did not resist thy word. Willingly I let myself be tied to the altar. My throat was raised to meet the knife. Let that plead with thee, and have thou pity on my children. Then Jacob raised his voice and spake, O Lord of the world, for 20 years I dwelt in the house of Laban, and when I left it, I met with Esau, who sought to murder my children, and I risked my life for theirs. And now they are delivered into the hands of their enemies like sheep led to the shambles, after I coddled them like fledglings breaking forth from their shells, after I suffered anguish for their sake all the days of my life. Let that plead with thee, and have thou pity on my children. And at last Moses raised his voice and spake, O Lord of the world, was I not a faithful shepherd unto Israel for 40 long years? Like a steed I ran ahead of him in the desert, and when the time came for him to enter the promised land, thou didst command, Here in the desert shall thy bones drop. And now that the children of Israel are exiled, thou hast sent for me to mourn and lament over them. That is what the people mean when they say, The good fortune of the master is none for the slave, but the master's woe is his woe. And turning to Jeremiah, he continued, Walk before me, I will lead them back. Let us see who will venture to raise a hand against them. Jeremiah replied, The roads cannot be passed, they are blocked with corpses. But Moses was not to be deterred, and the two, Moses following Jeremiah, reached the rivers of Babylon. When the Jews saw Moses, they said, The son of Amram has ascended from his grave to redeem us from our enemies. At that moment a heavenly voice was heard to cry out, It is decreed. And Moses said, O my children, I cannot redeem you. The decree is unalterable. May God redeem you speedily. And he departed from them. The children of Israel raised their voices in sore lamentations, and the sound of their grief pierced to the very heavens. Meantime Moses returned to the fathers, and reported to them to what dire suffering the exiled Jews were exposed, and they all broke out into woe-begone plaints. In his bitter grief Moses exclaimed, Be cursed, O sun! Why was not thy light extinguished in the hour in which the enemy invaded the sanctuary? The sun replied, O faithful shepherd, I swear by the life, I could not grow dark. The heavenly powers would not permit it. 60 fiery scourges they dealt me, and they said, Go and let thy light shine forth. Another last complaint Moses uttered, O Lord of the world, thou hast written it in thy Torah, and whether it be cow or ewe, ye shall not kill it, and her young both in one day. How many mothers have they slaughtered with their children, and thou art silent? Then with the suddenness of a flash, Rachel, our mother, stood before the Holy One. Blessed be he. Lord of the world, she said, thou knowest how overwhelming was Jacob's love for me, and when I observed that my father thought to put Leah in my place, I gave Jacob secret signs, that the plan of my father might be set at naught. But then I repented me of what I had done, and to spare my sister mortification, I disclosed the signs to her. More than this, I myself was in the bridal chamber, and when Jacob spake with Leah, I made reply lest her voice betray her. I, a woman, a creature of flesh and blood, of dust and ashes, was not jealous of my rival. Thou, O God, everlasting King, thou eternal and merciful Father, why wast thou jealous of the idols, empty vanities? Why hast thou driven out my children, slain them with swords, left them at the mercy of their enemies? Then the compassion of the supreme God was awakened, and he said, For thy sake, O Rachel, I will lead the children of Israel back to their land. Jeremiah's journey to Babylon. When Nebuchadnezzar dispatched his general Nebuzaradan to the capture of Jerusalem, he gave him 3 instructions regarding the mild treatment of Jeremiah. Take him and look well to him, and do him no harm, but do unto him even as he shall say unto thee. At the same time he enjoined him to use pitiless cruelty toward the rest of the people. But the prophet desired to share the fate of his suffering brethren, and when he saw a company of youths in the pillory, he put his own head into it. Nebuzaradan would always withdraw him again. Thereafter, if Jeremiah saw a company of old men clapped in chains, he would join them and share their ignominy, until Nebuzaradan released him. Finally, Nebuzaradan said to Jeremiah, Lo, thou art one of 3 things. Either thou art a prophesier of false things, or thou art a despiser of suffering, or thou art a shedder of blood. A prophesier of false things, for since many a year hast thou been prophesying the downfall of this city, and now when thy prophecy has come true, thou sorrowest and mournest. Or a despiser of suffering, for I seek to do thee naught harmful, and thou thyself pursuest what is harmful to thee, as thou to say, I am indifferent to pain. Or a shedder of blood, for the king has charged me to have a care of thee, and let no harm come upon thee. But as thou insistest upon seeking evil for thyself, it must be that the king may hear of thy misfortune, and put me to death. At first Jeremiah refused Nebuzaradan's offer to let him remain in Palestine. He joined the march of the captives going to Babylon along the highways streaming with blood and strewn with corpses. When they arrived at the borders of the Holy Land, they all, prophet and people, broke out into loud wails. And Jeremiah said, Yes, brethren and countrymen, all this hath befallen you, because ye did not hearken unto the words of my prophecy. Jeremiah journeyed with them until they came to the banks of the Euphrates. Then God spoke to the prophet, Jeremiah, if thou remainest here, I shall go with them, and if thou goest with them, I shall remain here. Jeremiah replied, Lord of the world, if I go with them, what doth it avail them? Only if their king, their creator, accompanies them, will it bestead them. When the captives saw Jeremiah make preparations to return to Palestine, they began to weep and cry, O Father Jeremiah, wilt thou too abandon us? I call heaven and earth to witness, said the prophet, had you wept but once in Zion, ye had not been driven out. Beset with terrors was the return journey for the prophet. Corpses lay everywhere, and Jeremiah gathered up all the fingers that lay about. He strained them to his heart, fondled them, kissed them, and wrapped them in his mantle, saying sadly, Did I not tell you, my children? Did I not say to you, Give glory to the Lord your God, before he cause darkness, and before your feet stumble upon the dark mountains? Dejected, oppressed by his grief, Jeremiah saw the fulfillment of his prophecy against the coquettish maidens of Jerusalem, who had pursued but the pleasures and enjoyments of the world. How often had the prophet admonished them to do penance and lead a God-fearing life? In vain. Whenever he threatened them with the destruction of Jerusalem, they said, Why should we concern ourselves about it? A prince will take me unto wife, said one. The other, a prefect, will marry me. And at first it seemed the expectations of Jerusalem's fair daughters would be realized, for the most aristocratic of the victorious Chaldeans were charmed by the beauty of the women of Jerusalem, and offered them their hand and their rank. But God sent disfiguring and repulsive diseases upon the women, and the Babylonians cast them off, threw them violently out of their chariots, and ruthlessly drove them over the prostrate bodies. Transportation of the captives. Nebuchadnezzar's orders were to hurry the captives along the road to Babylon without stop or stay. He feared the Jews might else find opportunity to supplicate the mercy of God, and he, compassionate as he is, would release them instantly they did penance. Accordingly, there was no pause in the forward march until the Euphrates was reached. There they were within the borders of the empire of Nebuchadnezzar, and he thought he had nothing more to fear. Many of the Jews died as soon as they drank of the Euphrates. In their native land they had been accustomed to the water drawn from springs and wells. Mourning over their dead and over the others that had fallen by the way, they sat on the banks of the river, while Nebuchadnezzar and his princes on their vessels celebrated their victory amid song and music. The king noticed that the princes of Judah, though they were in chains, bore no load upon their shoulders, and he called to his servants, "Have you no load for these?" They took the parchment scrolls of the law, tore them in pieces, made sacks of them, and filled them with sand. These they loaded upon the backs of the Jewish princes. At sight of this disgrace, all Israel broke out into loud weeping. The voice of their sorrow pierced the very heavens, and God determined to turn the world once more into chaos, for he told himself that after all the world was created but for the sake of Israel. The angels hastened thither, and they spake before God, O Lord of the world, the universe is thine. Is it not enough that thou hast dismembered thy earthly house, the temple? Wilt thou destroy thy heavenly house too? God, restraining them, said, Do ye think I am a creature of flesh and blood, and stand in need of consolation? Do I not know beginning and end of all things? Go rather and remove their burdens from the princes of Judah. Aided by God, the angels descended, and they carried the loads put upon the Jewish captives until they reached Babylon. On their way, they passed the city of Bari. The inhabitants thereof were not a little astonished at the cruelty of Nebuchadnezzar, who made the captives march naked. The people of Bari stripped their slaves of their clothes and presented the slaves to Nebuchadnezzar. When the king expressed his astonishment thereat, they said, We thought thou wert particularly pleased with naked men. The king at once ordered the Jews to be arrayed in their garments. The reward accorded the Bariites was that God endowed them forever with beauty and irresistible grace. The compassionate Bariites did not find many imitators. The very opposite quality was displayed by the Ammonites, Moabites, Edomites, and Arabs. Despite their close kinship with Israel, their conduct toward the Jews was dictated by cruelty. The two first mentioned, the Ammonites and the Moabites, when they heard the prophet foretell the destruction of Jerusalem, hastened without a moment's delay to report it to Nebuchadnezzar and urge him to attack Jerusalem. The scruples of the Babylonian king, who feared God and all the reasons he had advanced against a combat with Israel, they refuted, and finally they induced him to act as they wished. At the capture of the city, while all the strange nations were seeking booty, the Ammonites and the Moabites threw themselves into the temple to seize the scroll of the law, because it contained the clause against their entering into the assembly of the Lord, even to the 10th generation. To disgrace the faith of Israel, they plucked the cherubim from the Holy of Holies and dragged them through the streets of Jerusalem, crying aloud at the same time, Behold these sacred things that belong to the Israelites, who say ever they have no idols. The Edomites were still more hostile. In the hour of Israel's need, they went to Jerusalem with Nebuchadnezzar, but they kept themselves at a distance from the city, there to await the outcome of the battle between the Jews and the Babylonians. If the Jews had been victorious, they would have pretended they had come to bring them aid. When Nebuchadnezzar's victory became known, they showed their true feelings. Those who escaped the sword of the Babylonians were hewn down by the hand of the Edomites. But in fiendish cunning these nations were surpassed by the Ishmaelites. 80,000 young priests, each with a golden shield upon his breast, succeeded in making their way through the ranks of Nebuchadnezzar, and in reaching the Ishmaelites, they asked for water to drink. The reply of the Ishmaelites was, First eat, and then you may drink, at the same time handing them salt food. Their thirst was increased, and the Ishmaelites gave them leather bags filled with nothing but air instead of water. When they raised them to their mouths, the air entered their bodies, and they fell dead. Other Arabic tribes showed their hostility openly, as the Palmyrenes, who put 80,000 archers at the disposal of Nebuchadnezzar in his war against Israel. The sons of Moses. If Nebuchadnezzar thought that once he had the Jews in the regions of the Euphrates, they were in his power forever, he was greatly mistaken. It was on the very banks of the great river that he suffered the loss of a number of his captives. When the first stop was made by the Euphrates, the Jews could no longer contain their grief, and they broke out into tears and bitter lamentations. Nebuchadnezzar bade them be silent, and as though to render obedience to his orders the harder, he called upon the Levites, the minstrels of the temple, to sing the songs of Zion, for the entertainment of his guests at the banquet he had arranged. The Levites consulted with one another. Not enough that the temple lies in ashes because of our sins, should we add to our transgressions by coaxing music from the strings of our holy harps in honor of these dwarfs? They said, and they determined to offer resistance. The murderous Babylonians mowed them down in heaps, yet they met death with high courage, for it saved their sacred instruments from the desecration of being used before idols and for the sake of idolaters. The Levites who survived the carnage, the sons of Moses they were, bit their own fingers off, and when they were asked to play, they showed their tyrants mutilated hands, with which it was impossible to manipulate their harps. At the fall of night, a cloud descended and enveloped the sons of Moses and all who belonged to them. They were hidden from their enemies, while their own way was illuminated by a pillar of fire. The cloud and the pillar vanished at break of day, and before the sons of Moses lay a tract of land bordered by the sea on three sides. For their complete protection, God made the river Sambation to flow on the fourth side. This river is full of sand and stones, and on the 6 working days of the week they tumble over each other with such vehemence that the crash and the roar are heard far and wide. But on the Sabbath the tumultuous river subsides into quiet. As a guard against trespassers on that day, a column of cloud stretches along the whole length of the river, and none can approach the Sambation within 3 miles. Hedged in as they are, the sons of Moses yet communicate with their brethren of the tribes of Naphtali, Gad, and Asher, who dwell near the banks of the Sambation. Carrier pigeons bear letters hither and thither. In the land of the sons of Moses there are none but clean animals, and in every respect the inhabitants lead a holy and pure life, worthy of their ancestor Moses. They never use an oath, and if perchance an oath escapes the lips of one of them, he is at once reminded of the divine punishment connected with his act. His children will die at a tender age. The sons of Moses live peaceably and enjoy prosperity as equals through their common Jewish faith. They have need of neither prince nor judge, for they know not strife and litigation. Each works for the welfare of the community, and each takes from the common store only what will satisfy his needs. Their houses are built of equal height, that no one may deem himself above his neighbor, and that the fresh air may not be hindered from playing freely about all alike. Even at night their doors stand wide open, for they have naught to fear from thieves, nor are wild animals known in their land. They all attain a good old age. The son never dies before the father. When a death occurs, there is rejoicing, because the departed is known to have entered into life everlasting in loyalty to his faith. The birth of a child, on the other hand, calls forth mourning, for who can tell whether the being ushered into the world will be pious and faithful? The dead are buried near the doors of their own houses, in order that their survivors, in all their comings and goings, may be reminded of their own end. Disease is unknown among them, for they never sin, and sickness is sent only to purify from sins. Ebed-Melech. The sons of Moses were not the only ones to escape from under the heavy hand of Nebuchadnezzar. Still more miraculous was the deliverance of the pious Ethiopian Ebed-Melech from the hands of the Babylonians. He was saved as a reward for rescuing Jeremiah when the prophet's life was jeopardized. On the day before the destruction of the temple, shortly before the enemy forced his way into the city, the Ethiopian was sent by the prophet Jeremiah, acting under divine instruction, to a certain place in front of the gates of the city. to dole out refreshments to the poor from a little basket of figs he was to carry with him. Ebed-melech reached the spot, but the heat was so intense that he fell asleep under a tree, and there he slept for 66 years. When he woke up, the figs were still fresh and juicy, but all the surroundings had so changed he could not make out where he was. His confusion increased when he entered the city to seek Jeremiah, and found nothing as it had been. He accosted an old man and asked him the name of the place. When he was told it was Jerusalem, Ebed-melech cried out in amazement, "Where is Jeremiah? Where is Baruch? And where are all the people?" The old man was not a little astonished at these questions. How was it possible that one who had known Jeremiah and Jerusalem should be ignorant of the events that had passed 60 years before? In brief words, he told Ebed-melech of the destruction of the temple and of the captivity of the people, but what he said found no credence with his auditor. Finally, Ebed-melech realized that God had performed a great miracle for him, so that he had been spared the sight of Israel's misfortune. While he was pouring out his heart in gratitude to God, an eagle descended and led him to Baruch, who lived not far from the city. Thereupon Baruch received the command from God to write to Jeremiah that the people should remove the strangers from the midst of them, and then God would lead them back to Jerusalem. The letter written by Baruch and some of the figs that had retained their freshness for 66 years were carried to Babylonia by an eagle who had told Baruch that he had been sent to serve him as a messenger. The eagle set out on his journey. His first halting place was a dreary waste spot to which he knew Jeremiah and the people would come. It was the burial place of the Jews which Nebuchadnezzar had given the prophet at his solicitation. When the eagle saw Jeremiah and the people approach with a funeral train, he cried out, "I have a message for thee, Jeremiah. Let all the people draw nigh to receive the good tidings." As a sign that his mission was true, the eagle touched the corpse, and it came to life. Amidst tears, all the people cried unto Jeremiah, "Save us! What must we do to return to our land?" The eagle brought Jeremiah's answer to Baruch, and after the prophet had sent the Babylonian women away, he returned to Jerusalem with the people. Those who would not submit to the orders of Jeremiah relative to the heathen women were not permitted by the prophet to enter the holy city, and as they likewise were not permitted to return to Babylonia, they founded the city of Samaria near Jerusalem. The temple vessels. The task laid upon Jeremiah had been twofold. Besides giving him charge over the people in the land of their exile, God had entrusted to him the care of the sanctuary and all it contained. The holy ark, the altar of incense, and the holy tent were carried by an angel to the mount whence Moses before his death had viewed the land divinely assigned to Israel. There Jeremiah found a spacious place in which he concealed these sacred utensils. Some of his companions had gone with him to note the way to the cave, but yet they could not find it. When Jeremiah heard of their purpose, he censured them, for it was the wish of God that the place of hiding should remain a secret until the redemption, and then God himself will make the hidden things visible. Even the temple vessels, not concealed by Jeremiah, were prevented from falling into the hands of the enemy. The gates of the temple sank into the earth, and other parts and utensils were hidden in a tower at Baghdad by the Levite Shimur and his friends. Among these utensils was the 7-branched candlestick of pure gold, every branch set with 26 pearls, and beside the pearls 200 stones of inestimable worth. Furthermore, the tower at Baghdad was the hiding place for 77 golden tables, and for the gold with which the walls of the temple had been clothed within and without. The tables had been taken from paradise by Solomon, and in brilliance they outshone the sun and the moon, while the gold from the walls excelled in amount and worth all the gold that had existed from the creation of the world until the destruction of the temple. The jewels, pearls, gold and silver, and precious gems which David and Solomon had intended for the temple were discovered by the scribe Hilkiah, and he delivered them to the angel Shamshiel, who in turn deposited the treasure in Borsippa. The sacred musical instruments were taken charge of and hidden by Baruch and Zedekiah until the advent of the Messiah, who will reveal all treasures. In his time, a stream will break forth from under the place of the Holy of Holies and flow through the lands to the Euphrates, and as it flows, it will uncover all the treasures buried in the earth. End of chapter 10, part 2, The Exile.